Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's press conference. We have today with us Mike Smith, the chair of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in Eritrea. Mike will make a few opening remarks and then we'll take questions from the press. Please identify so we know who the questions are from. Okay, without further ado, I will pass over to Mike.
Thanks very much, Dan. Good morning, and thank you all for coming to this briefing on today's publication of the report of the UN Commission of Inquiry on Human Rights in Eritrea. As Dan just said, my name is Mike Smith, and I'm the chairperson of that commission. Today, I'm also representing, of course, my fellow commissioners, Victor Dankwa and Sheila B. Kitaruth, who are unable to be here. As Dan just said, I'll briefly present our report and then open the floor for any questions you may have. The Commission's first report, released 12 months ago, documented a multitude of human rights violations in Eritrea. Subsequently, the Human Rights Council asked us to determine whether these violations might amount to crimes against humanity and to address the issue of accountability. The Commission has concluded that Eritrean officials have committed crimes against humanity. The crimes of enslavement, imprisonment, enforced disappearance, torture, persecution, rape, murder, and other inhumane acts have been committed as part of a widespread and systematic campaign against the civilian population since 1991. The campaign has been aimed at maintaining control over the population and perpetuating the Eritrean leadership's rule. The Commission has made every effort to investigate the situation impartially and to report fairly, including with respect to serious human rights violations in Eritrea since the publication of our first report. Unfortunately, the gross human rights violations we have documented are continuing to take place. They often happen behind closed doors, and they continue to instill fear in Eritreans, not only in the country but also in the diaspora. The issues relating to Eritrea's military/national service programs include their arbitrary and indefinite duration, the use of conscripts as forced labour, including manual labour, the inhumane conditions of service, rape and torture often associated with service, and their devastating impact on family life and freedom of choice for the individuals. In addition, female conscripts are routine subject to domestic servitude. Despite promises to the contrary, the Eritrean government has taken no steps to address these problems. For these reasons, we have concluded that Eritrea's programs constitute the crime of enslavement. Eritrea's military national service programs are not the same as, for example, in Switzerland, where there are options about how a citizen can serve his or her country, where there are clear rules related to this service and full transparency. Very few Eritreans are ever released from their military service obligations. The use of arbitrary detention is and has been rampant across Eritrea. It is not only reserved for critics of the government. Indeed, many of the witnesses who we spoke to described arrest and lengthy detention for reasons difficult to discern or categorise. The vast majority of those detained said they had not been brought before a judge, tried, or involved in any form of judicial proceeding whatsoever. In addition, the government very rarely informs family members or judicial authorities about detentions, and most former detainees described widespread torture. In the past week, the Commission has received corroborated information that Eritreans expelled from Sudan to Eritrea in late May have been arrested and detained upon arrival in Eritrea, and that their families have had no access to them. Family members able to obtain unofficial information said that those who were in the national service prior to leaving the country were detained at Adiabeto prison on the outskirts of Asmara, and that those who had not yet undergone military training are currently detained elsewhere, including in Tessenay and Hashvere, apparently awaiting transfer to military training centres. Some family members in Eritrea were able to obtain information about detained individuals through informal means, and not because they were officially notified about the detention, or were they permitted to visit the detainees. These acts are ongoing and constitute crimes against humanity. The Commission has also found that the Eritrean government routinely detains innocent family members of individuals alleged to have committed a wrong. The Commission has concluded that these acts of reprisal also constitute a crime against humanity, and that it is ongoing. The government of Eritrea permits only 4 religious denominations to practice. Members of other religious denominations are often subject to detention until such time as they renounce their denomination and accept membership in an officially authorised group. Ethnic minorities, including the Kunama and Afar, have also been subject to arbitrary detention and extrajudicial killing. The Commission has found that this extreme discrimination constitutes the crime of persecution and that it is ongoing. Rape and murder have also been committed. These too are ongoing and constitute crimes against humanity. The Commission has found that the crimes it has documented have been committed primarily, directly or indirectly, by government and ruling party officials, military commanders and members of the National Security Office. The Commission has identified individual suspects and will provide files on those individuals to the High Commissioner for Human Rights to assist future accountability mechanisms. The Commission has also concluded that the Eritrean government has neither the political will nor the institutional capacity to prosecute the crimes we have documented. It recommends that the UN Security Council refer the situation in Eritrea to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and that the African Union establish an accountability mechanism. It has also asked member states to prosecute or extradite suspects on their territories. These accountability mechanisms are not mutually exclusive. It has also recommended that the Security Council impose travel bans and asset freezes on individuals suspected of crimes against humanity. The Commission has also reminded Eritrea in today's report and in the cover letter sent to President Isaias Afwerki of the importance of preventing the commission of crimes going forward. It has made 40 recommendations to the Government of Eritrea. Our recommendations are not exhaustive. The Commission remains open to engagement with the Government of Eritrea in order to provide justice for the Eritrean people. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now take your questions.
Tom Miles from Reuters. 2 questions, if I can. One is, I don't think you name anybody in the report, but is President Afwerki the top of the list for crimes against humanity? The second question is, do you have any estimate of how many people can be considered slaves or have been enslaved in the 25 years since independence? Thanks.
On the first question, we've deliberately not named people because that is really a matter for a properly constituted prosecuting mechanism to investigate and decide who to charge. So we don't want to prejudice anyone by naming them at this stage. As to the number of people who have served or who are continuing to serve in indefinite conditions of servitude, I wouldn't like to put a number to it, but I would say that everyone in Eritrea is obliged to do national service, that only the ones who manage to get in the top 10 percentile or so in their final year of training at SAWA go on and do tertiary education or training of some sort and therefore wind up serving their national service in an office or in some form of professional occupation, the bulk of the remainder go off and are sent to military units where they very often find themselves working in very poor conditions, labouring on agricultural projects, on infrastructural projects, and building projects. And these are the ones who are of greatest concern, of course, because not only are they doing very hard physical labour under extremely difficult conditions, but they are also subject to military discipline all the time. Many of them are not even able to get home once a year, which they're supposed to be. We've spoken to individuals who have maybe managed to get leave to go home once every 3 or 4 years.
Good morning, Lisa Schlein, Voice of America. Eritrea recently celebrated its independence, 25 years, and some of the media reports that I heard were rather flattering about the situation looking not so bad and people being able to talk to them, and you seem to have something there about what looks like perhaps a Potemkin village in Asmara. If you could elaborate upon that, I mean, is the government particularly clever that it's able to pull the wool over the international media's eyes? And then this situation, as you say, has been going on for 25 years since independence was achieved. Do you, from looking at what you discovered last year in your report, do you think that the situation is worsening, that in fact it has worsened since last year, and that this is something that will continue unless something happens to stop it?
Thank you. Yes, actually you raise a very interesting point, which is that many casual visitors to Asmara, and frankly even people, foreigners who are living there, describe a situation which sounds very different from the sort of picture that we paint in our report. There's something of a conundrum there, but my only explanation that I can offer is that human rights abuses of the type that we describe don't generally happen in the streets of Asmara. They are happening in detention centres across the country. They're happening in military camps. They're happening in training centres where foreigners simply do not have access. The second point I'd make is, yes, that Eritrea has recently celebrated its 25th anniversary, which ought to be an occasion of great joy. I have to say that we in the Commission were rather hoping that the government would make some major gestures at that time, perhaps release many of the political prisoners that they've been holding over the years, maybe introduce a new constitution, maybe take some of the steps that we have recommended both in our first and our second report, but actually to date we haven't heard any of that. On your third point, which is to say, is the situation worsening? It's very difficult for us to tell. I mean, frankly, we do notice that in some respects there have been improvements. We do notice that there have been far more visits by international journalists. The government has been on an offensive to try to showcase the country in a very controlled fashion, and this, in a sense, is a positive thing. We've also noticed that some people who are serving their national service, particularly those, as I said, the lucky ones who are not in military units but are rather working in Asmara, are able to go to their nominal jobs for a short time, sign in, and then go off and do something else. So there is a little bit of relaxation there that apparently is happening. But in the fundamental areas that we're talking about, which is to say the areas of enforced disappearances, the areas of detention without any form of oversight by any sort of judiciary, in the area of having a rule of law, by which I mean a situation where the law is paramount, not the will of the government, that in those important areas there has been no change that we can detect.
Just a quick follow-up, a clarification. You mentioned early on about the Eritreans who apparently were deported from Sudan to Eritrea? Could you?
Well,
I'm
look,
unfamiliar with that. When did that happen, and is that what happened?
well, I think that happened in the last few days of May. I think UNHCR has put out a press release regarding those. We have, of course, been rushing to try to gather some information on that, but we've been very limited in what we can find out. So I just mentioned that in passing. You might be able to find out more information from UNHCR.
Hi, Mr. Smith. Jamie Keaton from Associated Press. The first question, I should have probably know this from the report, but in terms of your methodology and the access that you've had to victims and also to government officials that may have you had access to the country even? And then my second question is just about sort of the fallout from these abuses. I mean, as you surely know, a number of Eritreans have been fleeing the country even as far as Europe, and I'm just wondering how much you would attribute these abuses to fanning or undergirding the flight of these people from to Europe in particular.
Thank you very much. Yes, in terms of the methodology, first of all, we were quite limited because right from the word go, the Eritrean government indicated that it would not cooperate with this commission, which means it has not agreed to us visiting. So we have followed a methodology that's been used by previous commissions of inquiry, and we believe is quite validated, and that is to interview as many people as we could outside of the country who have experience of the sorts of human rights problems that we are investigating. So we contacted, we threw the net pretty wide. We used advertisements in papers and also on the internet calling for submissions and for witnesses to come forward. We visited 13 countries, I believe, to gather direct testimony, and the bulk of our work was frankly based on individual interviews, confidential interviews, I hasten to add, with individuals who had something to tell us. Now, I would emphasize here that the way we do those interviews is not to say, what's your view of what is happening in the country? We're not interested in that. We know that there are many different views, and that will depend upon where you're coming from, what your political views are, etc. What we asked people was to tell us their story. What happened to you? What happened where? Where did that happen? Can you give us the name of people involved, etc., etc.? And that way we got a whole series of personal experiences, which we then built up. And out of that, when you can put these one on top of another, you can build up a picture of where things are happening. And in some cases, as I've already said, we can actually do better than that. We can actually gather sufficient testimony that is corroborative, that we can actually say, yes, we think definitely this has happened. And we've pulled that into files, which we, as I said, will pass on to the High Commissioner, and they may be useful for a future judicial process. On the second question related to the follow-up, I think, the follow-up, of course, is up to the Human Rights Council and many others, not to us. Our job was simply to investigate and to draw attention to the problems that were occurring there, and then to offer our take on whether these comprise crimes against humanity. But we have made a series of recommendations to the international community, including on accountability, which is to say that given that there is very, very little chance that people who have been committing these crimes, and let me remind everyone that crimes against humanity are individual crimes. We're not just talking about a government or an organisation that's doing these. We are talking about individuals who are criminally responsible for these actions. There are international mechanisms that can investigate these things and charge people. Of course, the principal one is the International Criminal Court. Eritrea is not a party to the statutes, so that's not automatic, but the Security Council can refer any situation such as this to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and that would be a mechanism which would then be able to look at our files, subject to the agreement, I would have to say, from the witnesses that we've got, and they might then decide on where to move from there. But there are some other mechanisms too. For example, the African Union has in the past set up its own special tribunal, such as the one that recently delivered a verdict, I think, on Hussein Habre. Then there are some countries around the world which can exercise jurisdiction if they happen to have the individual in the country concerned. So that's another possibility. Of course, these are all far beyond the scope of our commission of inquiry. That's up to other governments and other people to make decisions on. Sorry, yes, I missed one question, which is the issue of why people are crossing the Mediterranean. Well, obviously we believe that a major impetus behind what's happening is these various problems that we've identified. That doesn't mean that every one of those individuals who is risking their lives crossing the border, first of all, because we believe there is still a shoot-to-kill policy that exists for those crossing the border, though, again, and this goes a little bit to the earlier question, it seems to be an area where there is some relaxation, certainly at the local level, as to whether the soldiers really do shoot or not, or shoot all the time. So people risk their lives just crossing the border. They then risk their lives crossing the desert to get to the northern the southern Mediterranean, that is the north of Africa, to Libya and similar places, from where they can then get a boat and risk that journey across to Europe, which is extremely dangerous. Now, people have to have a lot of motivation to do that sort of thing, and I think a part of it is some of those people, as the ones, certainly many that we've interviewed, have actually been detained and seriously abused and mistreated. Others simply see the situation as hopeless, in the sense that they have no choice. And we have had, I can remember at least two of the people that I interviewed actually saying, we have had our dreams stolen. One guy said he wanted to be an athlete, and he figured he was pretty good at it, but then he went into national service and he wound up working on a plantation for a colonel somewhere. You know, it's that sort of situation with no hope of ever getting out. So, you know, those are the people who then, when they have the opportunity, take the risk and cross the border. So I would say that it's, I know that the government says, and others say, that these people are primarily motivated by wish to improve their economic circumstances. There's probably a bit of that in it, but at root the problem is the way the system works.
Nick Cumming-Bruce, New York Times. Can you say, are you asking for travel bans and asset freezes against the political leadership and military leadership of the country? And I have a follow-up.
What we're asking for is for the Security Council to contemplate targeted these sorts of responses to individuals who are involved in the crimes against humanity. And as I said, we've got lists of names and files, and you know, when that situation arises, it'll be up to the High Commissioner on handing those things over.
Well, can you give us a bit more detail on how many names you've got on this list, and where are these dossiers? Are they now deposited with the Office of the High Commissioner?
Yeah, all of the material that we've gathered, which is over the transcripts of over 800 interviews, are in a special, highly secure database, and with very strict controls on who has access to it. In fact, once our commission has finished its work, only under extremely tight conditions can anyone access it. So yes, they are. All of those names are there. I'm not going to give you even a ballpark figure of how many individuals we're talking about. We're talking about quite a few.
But I mean, is it hundreds or thousands or tens?
No, look, I'd rather not say.
Mr. President, just on the methods part.
Sorry, can you just introduce
the
yourself?
accused are very strict, they are very tough.
Excuse me, can you just introduce yourself where you're from?
Yes,
please?
sure.
Thank you.
My name is Guido Talarico. I'm from Edian Kronos Press Agency of Rome, Italy. So the question is regarding the interviews that you're talking that you have done several interviews of. Where have been held, the places, because of course makes a difference. And the second question regards Eritrea is part of the Universal Periodic Review. Why in this case you changed the method? Thank you.
Well, I'll answer the second one first. The UPR is a completely different process. The UPR, as you know, is a mechanism that's used in the Human Rights Council, which all member states of the UN are subject to, and everyone has to routinely appear. It's a very interesting mechanism. I used to work with the Commission on Human Rights, and it's a new mechanism since those days, and I understand it's one of the successes of the Human Rights Council. But it's still a fairly limited mechanism in the sense that it's one where I believe the country comes in for a morning or something. Members of the Human Rights Council pose questions, they answer the questions, and then there are recommendations made. The Eritrean government has engaged in the UPR process, which is a very positive thing, and we do not criticise that. In fact, we're very supportive of that. Why, in addition, there's this other mechanism, the Commission of Inquiry, and indeed the Special Rapporteur. I'm not the one to answer that question because that was a decision of the Human Rights Council. But the fact that the Human Rights Council decided to, first of all, create the Special Rapporteur and then the Commission of Inquiry suggests to me that they weren't happy with just the UPR. And I think out of the last UPR, I think there were some hundreds of recommendations made. The Eritrean government accepted some 92 of them, I believe, which were virtually all economic and social rights, and they didn't accept any of the ones related to civil and political rights, virtually none in the area that we're talking about. So that's probably why the Council decided. Your first part was about where we interviewed. Well, we interviewed basically, we went to the places where there were the largest number of Eritreans in the diaspora, where there were people who were likely to want to talk to us and had the sorts of information we were seeking. Now, this is going back to our last report, because we did most of the interviews then. We wrote to, I think, 25 countries or something that fall into that category and asked if they would agree to us visiting. I think a dozen or so wrote back and said they did agree, and we went to most of those countries, not all of them, but most of them. So those included a number of European countries, Switzerland for one, Italy, Germany, Sweden, UK, Netherlands. It included the United States and Australia, Canada, but it also included Ethiopia and Djibouti. Now, we would have liked the largest number of Eritreans in the diaspora, probably in Ethiopia and Sudan. The Sudanese did not ever respond or agree to our visiting. Otherwise, we would have visited there. There are also significant communities elsewhere in African countries, countries of first asylum, if you like. But again, we were never either our request to come was never answered, or we were told no. So that's the answer.
Oh, over here.
Laurent Siro, Swiss News Agency. After your first report, did you get any request from national judiciary systems in countries where the diaspora is hugely present? And would you agree to share the evidences you mentioned on some individual with the national judiciary apparatus that could be interested in prosecuting this?
The answer is, I think, no. I don't think any national judiciary has contacted us on that matter. Hypothetically, were one to contact us, I think what we would do is we would probably either, well, certainly we would consult with the individuals that we had interviewed who had relevant information and say to them, would you like to be involved in this? And if so, why don't you contact? In other words, we would take ourselves out of the process. That would then be up to the individual or the organisation or whatever that could then contact the National Judicial Authority.
Marta Hurtado, Spanish News Agency. I have two questions. The first one is coming back to your recommendation to refer the subject to the International Criminal Court. You already asked last year to the international community to do so. I guess no one did anything, the Security Council didn't. Do you think that the fact that you have proven that the crimes against humanity committed widespread might change the situation? And my second question is regarding these 45,000 written submissions you got and that you guess are coming from the government. How do you describe this behavior? Thank you.
First of all, I think it's worthwhile understanding that a commission of inquiry such as this is not a judicial mechanism, and it does not have the power to find, to prove one thing or another. It is much more like an investigating mechanism, like a prosecutor or even a police investigation, where you are trying to gather enough information to be able to say there is a case to answer. In English law, I know we would say a prima facie case. I think in the International Criminal Court they talk about reasonable grounds to believe, and that's really our level of proof. Now, of course, as I said earlier, we're quite hampered. It would be like a police trying to investigate a crime where the only people they could speak to were the victims. They were not able to go to the site where the crime happens and take physical evidence. They weren't able to interview the people who are accused of the crime. So we get only one end of it, if you like. But given the circumstances, we believe we have reasonable grounds to conclude what we've concluded. And we now hand that over to whoever else has the means and the mandate to investigate that and make determinations properly. And that's why we talk about referring to the International Criminal Court or to some other sort of body. Now, on your question about the 45,000 submissions we got, we of course took these very seriously. I mean, this is unprecedented, I have to say, in commissions of inquiry. I don't think any commission of inquiry have ever had remotely this number of submissions, and it's very clearly a direct response to our first report. Now, overwhelmingly, these responses were critical of our first report. Many of them were in the form of a printed sort of letter into Gdynia, where the same points were made and there was a signature scrawled at the bottom. So clearly this was, if you like, a campaign. The fact that there were variations, but the major points were rather similar on what they were criticising about the first report. We decided to follow up by, we couldn't follow up 45,000. We simply didn't have the resources or the time to do that. But we did at least try to follow up where we had contact details, a proportion of those that came in from each of the relevant countries of the diaspora, and we did that. Now, it was quite interesting, and quite a lot of the numbers, the telephone numbers, didn't work, so we were a bit stymied there. Those people we did speak to fall into various categories. There were some who said, yeah, they didn't agree with they agreed with some of the things that they had signed on to, but they didn't agree with some others. Virtually none of them, I should say, had actually read the report. They had simply been told that this is what the report said. Some of them said they didn't know that their signatures were there. They figured someone else had simply put it on. Some of them were quite genuine in the sense that these actually were aggrieved by what we said about Eritrea, and they were quite happy to sign onto it. So there was quite a bit of a variation there in those groups. We then looked at the substance of what was said. We went through it very carefully, analysed it, and at the end of the day we decided that there was not enough there that changed our views on what we had concluded.
Tom Miles again from Reuters on your left. Sorry, I had a question, but I have a couple of questions, but we've got the response from the Eritrean government, which I'm just reading. One of the things they mention is you've disregarded testimonies of 42,000 diaspora Eritreans. Did you tell them you got 42,000 testimonies? Otherwise, how did they know if they didn't send them themselves? And then I'll follow up with my question. Thanks.
Well, they know that because in our report, well, they've got our report. We gave the report to the Eritreans several days ago as a matter of courtesy. So they know we got that. Although it's interesting, we think it's closer to 45,000. But in any event, our strong suspicion is that this is a campaign that has been organised from Asmara, and that there are various supportive groups in the diaspora around the world, youth and women's union people, etc., have been mobilised to get signatures to these sorts of petitions. So we regard that as the most likely outcome. Sorry, your second part of your question? Yes, yeah. Yes, I might just add that in all of those 45,000 odd, we only received 8 submissions from Eritrea itself, which is kind of interesting.
I was just interested. They had a figure of 42, and it sort of sounds like they know more about it than you do.
Maybe they do. They probably know more than I do. Yes.
But I wanted to ask a bit more about enslavement, if I could. Going back to my first question about how many people are enslaved, I realise you can't put an exact figure on it, but it may not be immediately apparent from people reading the headlines whether we're talking about 10 people have been enslaved or 10,000 or a couple of 100,000. So if you can put a ballpark figure on that, would be useful. And secondly, do you have any evidence, or have you heard anything about slave labour being exported to other countries? And thirdly, have you talked to any companies that might be using slave labour in Eritrea, foreign companies, and are they concerned about it? Thanks.
Okay. Well, first of all, in terms of the estimates, I mean, I've just given an estimate here that we probably think there's 300,000 to 400,000 people who have been enslaved. I would come back and repeat what I said earlier on this, that to be enslaved in these terms, enslavement's a strange concept actually, because we tend to think of it as an old thing relating to people who were owned as chattels and treated like the belongings of extremely wealthy and powerful people. Modern slavery is a little different from that, and the principal elements are that the complete loss of choice, the fact that you are having to work and that you're not remunerated for your work, that you have to work come what may. Now, even within the national service system within Eritrea, there are those, and I think I've already mentioned them, those who are relatively free, who can come and go, who are in a desk job in Asmara or something, or they might be working in a hotel. Okay, they're paid a pittance, but they live at home. They can have a family, etc. Those people, personally, I would not regard them as enslaved. The ones who are the ones who are in the military units and who are in some remote part of the country living in deplorable conditions under very strict military discipline, completely lost control of their lives, and they're going to be potentially there for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Those are the people that we are really concerned about. Now, you asked a follow-up question, which was about company. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I don't think we've got any information about export of slave labour, no. In terms of companies, I think the companies are very aware of the importance of not being caught up in this, and they, I think, are going to, at least the foreign companies, are going to considerable lengths to try to ensure that they do not use this sort of national service labour.
Hi, Ben Simon from AFP. I was hoping, if possible, that maybe you could preempt the briefing we'll get from the delegation from Asmara later. Are you able to talk in substance about your interaction with the government? Did you feel like you were in a room with individuals in any meetings where these allegations were being taken seriously? In detail, how did you respond to them, and what were those meetings like?
We've had very few meetings with Eritrean officials. In fact, I think I have had two. One was here, and that was right at the start, where as a matter of courtesy we went and spoke to the mission here. The second was with the ambassador and the deputy ambassador in New York, and that was quite a cordial meeting, but there was no meeting of minds, can I say, and I didn't really get an impression that our concerns were being taken on board. So no, I don't think that there's been a lot of meeting of minds at all on this.
Okay, we've got time for a couple more questions, if there are any more.
Hi, I'm Pierre Monigia. I work for the French television, France 2, and with my team we were actually part of the foreign journalists who were allowed to enter Eritrea after 2 years of negotiation. I understand that you see this as a sort of attempt from Eritreans to show the other side of their country. I can tell you it was. It was also a very disturbing experience. It is not North Korea. It is not exactly the same way. It's a very more subtle way of imposing something on the people. But my question is more, how do you see this could affect the attitude of European nations? We've seen European nations already starting to maybe change their attitude towards refugees from Eritrea. At a time where Europe is facing an influx from refugees from all over the world, it could also help. Do you see this as a potential risk, and are you trying to counter this in this report?
First of all, I have to say that we do welcome the initiative of the Eritrean government to open up and allow more international press in. Any additional sort of information that can come out is, of course, a positive. And we hope that this also means that has an impact, maybe just superficial if it's just related to Asmara and around Asmara, but nonetheless an impact in some ways on the way in which people are treated. We do not believe that these visits, and including a number of quite positive reports that have emerged as a result of these meetings, they do not, in our view, do anything to invalidate the conclusions we've reached. As I've pointed out, the sorts of things we're talking about do not happen, in the places where international press can get to. Anyone, a foreigner who wants to leave Asmara has to have permission to leave. So, it's not really a place where it's easy to do investigative journalism. On your second part of your question, which is related to the flow of people coming to Europe, and the fact that obviously this is a matter of major concern to European governments, and therefore they're looking for ways to deal with this. Of course, we're very much aware of that, and that's in the background. Our report is not designed to play into that debate at one level, except to say, hang on, the really bad things that are happening are continuing to happen, and therefore be very careful with the decisions you make that could put people in greater danger. Be aware that the aid programs which you institute, which we are very supportive of, I must say, because I do believe, all of us believe, that the only way out of this, the only way to convince this government to relax and make life better for ordinary people is through interaction, engagement with the international community. So we're very much in favour of this. But the human rights stuff has to be up front. There has to be changes in the rule of law. There has to be some sort of a response to all of these things that are happening. I mean, there's a range of things that we recommend. You can look through the recommendations and see. And the European governments, we hope, will look at this report, will therefore take these recommendations and put them up front in their discussions with the Eritreans.
Yes.
Last question over here.
Thank you. Yes, I as the French colleague, me too, I was allowed to go to Eritrea, and I was there with a bunch of Italian journalists that we have the chance to travel all the country to interview people, to go to the Bisha mining, to Asmara, to Massawa. So, of course, I can understand what you're saying, but from the same times, it's hard for us to believe that, what is the real truth. So I come back to the subject. You know that in 45 minutes here in this place, the Eritrean government will do a press conference where they'll deny what we are saying, the allegation. So would you believe that you have a good possibilities to prove all that is been part of your report? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, look, it's a good question, because you're right. They're going to say, they're going to deny all this. They're going to say, we don't know anything. We haven't even been to the country, so how can we talk about this? I think the answer to that, and the questions which you can pose, are, where is the rule of law in this country? Can you name a country around the world which does not have rule of law? And by which I mean, as I said earlier, that the law is paramount, that the government and the agents of the government are subject to the law, that people whose rights are abused have an avenue to raise their grievances, that when they do so, they're not going to be arrested and thrown into detention again, but rather they're going to be heard before a properly constituted independent court, which is staffed by judges who are not frightened of being themselves arrested. When you have a situation like that, then you can start to deny these things. But so long as there is no constitution, so long as there is no free press, and let me remind you that the Reporters Without Borders have, I think, categorized Eritrea for the 8th year in a row as the least free press country in the world, where there are no serious NGOs except government ones. In other words, there is no civil society to challenge the government, where there is no political opposition, where people can actually raise and criticize government for its actions, where there is no parliament even, where you can debate national questions, where there is a national service which is unending, where people are controlled in that way. In these circumstances, look, you can deny as much as you like, but how believable are those denials in a situation such as that? I would put it to you that there is no country, if you put all those things together. Look, was it Lord Acton who said power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely? I think this is a classic example.
Thank you, and on that note, we'll end this press conference.